At this point, after going through the videos of Muslim scholars or what I knew about Islam or Muslim apologists and Christian apologists, going over that, and also listening to my American dad and going over some part of the Bible with them, one thing I came to a conclusion, and I was like, I don't think there are a lot of differences between Islam and Christianity. For me, I thought there were major differences where we don't believe in this blood sacrifice, this penal substitution, or the penalty to be paid for our sins, and we don't believe Jesus is God. And they were like, yeah, my American parents, specifically my American mom, was like, yeah, that's the only difference, but it's a significant difference. And I was like, yeah, you're right, it is a huge difference. And my American dad even talked about that. He was saying that if you don't believe in Jesus, it's another, again, verse from the Gospels, is that I'm the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So that pretty clearly states that anyone who is not accepting Jesus is basically going to hell. That's the concept of Christianity. And also, according to Islam, it's very clear that Jesus is not God. There's no Trinity. If you set up an idol, in this case, you're accepting Jesus as God, then they will be going to hell. So according to both religions, this is the clear-cut difference. That's it. Islam says you can't believe in Jesus as being God, and Christianity says that you cannot even be saved if you don't believe that Jesus is the only way. He is, in this case, he's God. He's the Son of God. So for me, that's where the other set of questions were. I had heard the apologists said, well, Jesus never said he's God. Nowhere in the entire set of 4 Gospels, he never said that. Of course, there were Christian apologists who were replying to that. Okay, well, just because it doesn't say in those exact words Jesus is God does not mean he's not stating that. There are many other places Jesus has said a lot of different things. For example, before Abraham was, I am. That was a clear-cut statement to show that how can Jesus be before Abraham was? He's the only one who has been there forever, so he is God. He never committed a sin. He's perfect. Only God can be perfect. And there were other references that were brought up from the Gospel specifically. I was not fully convinced about that. Another thing I was mainly asking about was like, well, it does say a lot that he's the Son of God. What does that mean? Does that mean he's God? My American dad and my American mom might have been listening to other apologists online, the Christian apologists, is that, he's the Son of God. It's very clearly stated. And John talks about that, the Gospel John. So I was like, okay, let's look through again to the Old Testament. And I wanted to see if this term was ever used before. Once I started to look through, in Genesis 6, 1-2, it used the term Son of God. It basically says that there were these sons of God who saw the daughters of men and they took them as their wives. And there's also discussion about like there were children born to them and they were quite powerful and famous men that were born out of the daughter of men and sons of God. So for me it was like, okay, who are these sons of God here? Are they also God? Because they're called sons of God? Of course, my American dad was like, well, no, we actually don't know who they are. There are some that who state they're angels, some who state that might be some other men. Out of curiosity, I actually did search if they were angels a little bit myself, but I did find that according to Matthew 22, I found out that actually angels are prohibited from having any kind of relationship between men and wives. It implies, at least. So I was like, okay, well, this probably is not angels, or if they are, then there's a conflict. Then I also found a reference in Job 1. In different versions of the Bible, it uses different words, but in some versions it says they are angels. In some versions it says they are son of God. But this also actually showed that, okay, maybe sons of God means angels. So then I was like, okay, so who is Jesus when he's called son of God or when he claims himself to be son of God? Is he just stating that he is a good person who has a special connection with God? Is he an angel? Because it could also mean that he's perfect. Maybe he's saying that he's not a sinner because he is the Son of God. Maybe that's what he's saying. But what really I was trying to say is that, to me, based on just looking at these evidence, it wasn't enough to believe that Son of God really just translated to Jesus being God. The other thing that my American parents, specifically my American dad, was also showing me was that the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, talks about Jesus all the time. They were already predicting, they were already looking, they were already waiting for this Messiah. And there aren't really many or any predictions they had seen about Prophet Muhammad. And I was like, okay, what are these predictions? My American dad even drew this picture again. I guess we were both visual people, so we used to do this a lot. Because we went over some prophecies in the Old Testament. Interestingly, my American dad also explained to me that these references, these prophecies, are actually always have two meanings. One of them is right then. So most of the time, these prophecies were fulfilled, usually right away. For example, we went over the prophecy that a virgin will give birth. It actually was fulfilled later on. There was a son born. In Isaiah 7:14, it talks about like the seed of virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel. Emmanuel basically means God with us. It says that Jesus was also named Emmanuel, that he is God with us. And they were also saying that, okay, well, this could also mean that God literally is here with us. Of course, I wasn't fully convinced by that either, because I thought this was just a name. But my dad was saying that, that this prophecy actually got fulfilled right away. But then it also has a second meaning which applies to Jesus. And he said this happens to mostly all the prophecies in the Old Testament. We went over the prophecies in Isaiah 53, that this Messiah would basically be the one who will be sacrificed. So this was also to point out that, Messiah is going to be sacrificed, and it is Jesus, and he's going to pay this final penalty. So even the prophecy about Isaiah 53, which again I did not know, it was actually about Israel. And then it actually also applies to Jesus. Basically, my American dad was saying there are two meanings of prophecy always. Well, I was like, okay, I guess I can see that, but I also thought, isn't it that you're looking too much into this and maybe trying to connect too many things about Jesus, even if they do not connect? I did not know that, of course, the Gospels and even epistles were talking about some of these prophecies and connecting them to Jesus, because I had not read them completely myself. But I couldn't understand. I was like, what is this reason? How do you know that these also apply to Jesus? Because you saw, just because now you see it, Jesus doing something, and are like, oh well, see, this is fulfilling this prophecy. But like, how do you know this was about Jesus? You're looking at evidence, and now it's trying to go back to the hypothesis. For me, it's like a scientific process. Like you come up with a hypothesis first, and then you try to see if there's evidence to support this hypothesis. You don't just see evidence and then go back to the hypothesis and say, okay, well, I saw this evidence, now let's see if I can find my hypothesis to say, this is what I actually meant, what I wanted to predict. So I wasn't convinced about the concept of these prophecies, that somehow they apply it twice. But I did see them. I did see that they were there. These were the main things that I was learning with the conversation with my American dad, mainly trying to see where to see Jesus in the Old Testament, and how this proves that there is these prophecies about him. The Old Testament completely talks about him, that he was coming, the Messiah was coming, the Messiah was going to sacrifice himself for the sins of the world. I did see one Muslim apologist point out to the verses in Deuteronomy 18, starting from the verse 15, that Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him. So I'm reading from the Christian Standard Bible. God says he will put his words in the prophet's mouth, and the prophet will tell them everything that God commands him. And it continues about that. But this was very similar to, or some of the things that the prophet had said, that in the Quran it says that he's not saying any of this from on his own. These are the words that God sends him. And he just basically narrates them back to the people. This seemed very similar to what it says in Deuteronomy. This was, to me, one of the only times when I was very convinced that at least there is a reference about the prophet in the Bible, in Deuteronomy in this case. Of course, when I listened to Christian apologists, they said this is only about Jesus. It's not about the prophet Muhammad, because it says, God says he will raise a prophet among them. And in this case, among is the nation of Israel and the lineage of Isaac and Jacob and all of them. And of course, the prophet Muhammad was not from that lineage. He's coming from the lineage of Ishmael, the first son of prophet Abraham. So I was like, okay, well then it actually would apply to him, because he is technically their brother. If we don't start from Jacob or Isaac, if we go to Abraham, then actually, they are connected to each other. So it actually does apply to him. So this was one that was interesting to me. I don't think I talked about this with my American dad much because, again, we had so many other things to talk about. One time in the church, either the Christmas service or one of the service, I was going with my parents to the church also where my American dad was the pastor, so he was the preacher, so I would go with my American mom and the kids. It was just a pamphlet, or I guess one of the things you get when you go to church. So they were passing and I saw it and I was just going through it, and it read these verses from Isaiah 9, and it says, again, Christian Standard Bible version, "For a child will be born for us, a son will be given to us, and the government will be on his shoulders. He will be named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace." I was like, whoa, this is crazy, because it says this son will be God. He's going to be God. Because one of the questions I was asking my parents was like, okay, so you've shown me Messiah is going to be this person who will be sacrificed. He's been all over the Bible. Where does it say that the Messiah will actually be God? Nowhere does it say the Messiah will be God. Because that's really what we're trying to find, right? That Jesus is God. So when I read this, I was so surprised. I had not read this before. I was like, wow. I showed this to my American mom. I was like, wait, this says he'll be God. And she was like, yeah. I was like, okay. I guess I went back home to my apartment and I was like, I gotta search about this. Because if this is the case, then yeah, Messiah is God. And that means Jesus is God. So I read through different versions of the Bible at that time. And my American dad had told me, like, okay, it's better that you do look into other versions just to, sometime one version might be too literal or something like that. So I went over different versions. Most versions said very similar things. There were some differences. I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to try to find a Hebrew, like the Old Testament, which is written by the Jews. Because I know they don't believe that Jesus was even born of a virgin and he was even a prophet or anything. Because, my main thing was always to find the other side of things always. Because, if I'm listening to Muslim scholars, I'm also listening to the Christian apologists. In this case, now I was completely open, and I was happy to accept any evidence that that was available. So I did my search, and I found Hebrew Old Testament that was written for Jews. In that one, however, the translation actually did not say that the son who is born is going to be called Mighty God. It was that the mighty God was a different figure and the son was a different person. So the son was going to be the prince that was promised, so Prince of Peace. But mighty God was a separate person that was showed. So essentially it was mighty God and Prince of Peace. And I was like, okay, so there is at least some variation. I did ask about it with my American parents, and I also tried to look online about it. Mainly the argument was that, well, of course the Jewish people are going to say that because they're going to translate it like this. But for me it was like, okay, well, there's their book, and I assume they would know Hebrew, but I can of course see the other argument that they are biased. So this was a point that maybe it's an impasse, so I stopped there. But it was something that I was surprised by. And one of the very first things I talked to my American dad and mom was that Bible has been corrupted. We only have one version of the Quran, but there's so many versions of the Bible. What's up with that? And they were like, okay, look, you can open it, you can go look at different versions. Christian Standard Bible, American Standard Bible, NIV, NRSV, RSV, ESV, all these different versions. And they're all going to say very similar things. And I was like, really? So I'm like, they're not the same. They're like, no, but that Bible is not the same way as the Quran in this case. We're not word for word. The meaning stays the same if you read them. And I read it, and most of the time I found that they were very similar. For example, Christian Standard Bible, American Standard Bible, KJV, NIV. If you read most words, they were saying the same thing. Of course, they were not the exact same words, but they were pretty similar. And that was enough for me. I mean, there were some differences I did find between, let's say, KJV and ESV. I think there were like one or two verses that were not there. Most of it was similar, so I accepted. Because I was like, okay, God's word is not just the words themselves, it's actually the meaning. What is it? What is God really trying to say? God is telling me not to lie. He could say in many different ways, but at the end of the day, the core message is the same. So for me, that was enough. This now gets me to the point where I graduated from my master's from the Penn State Harrisburg campus in August 2017. And then I was moving to State College, which is a different town in Pennsylvania, about 2.5 hours away. So that's where my journey then continued. And my hope was that I'll continue to stay connected with my American dad and mom. And of course, I'm still connected with them to this day. During that time in State College too, so that way, I would go back, or sometime I would even call. Just because if I had any questions, I would just call them about this, specifically my American dad. Just to clarify, at that time, I had still not started reading the Quran on my own. But in State College, in the next videos, I'll talk about that. I actually started that. But yeah, so there weren't any conclusions, but the search continued.